Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Orthodox Shahada. It's been a long time, actually, since I've done a stream. If there's any sound issues, please let me know. But I'm back here with Dr. Beau Branson, once again, our favorite analytic philosopher, to come and talk about a debate he had recently with Jake the Muslim Metaphysician. Actually, I think I've put the video in the description, so if you want to watch the debate, go watch it. I recommend you watch the debate before watching this so that you kind of have a fresh thought. How are you doing, Doctor?
Pretty good. Glad to be home from doing a lot of traveling this summer. So
Well, we actually saw each other in London.
yeah, it was nice to actually see in person. So
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're in a bit of a rush, so we couldn't
yeah,
do
couldn't hang
much,
out a
but
lot, but it was
it
nice
was
to
nice
see
to see you for sure.
you too.
So, we're basically going to do a review of the debate and just kind of what some important points that we think were kind of teased out of this whole interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, like what were your impressions? Like, how did you feel afterwards?
I mean, my view on it was I think exactly what I thought was going to happen is what happened. So part of what I said in my opening statement was just kind of outlining, different ways you could support a view. You could support a view based on experience a posteriori. You can try to support it a priori. If it's a priori, it's going to either be a truth of logic or something that's true by definition, or it'll be synthetic a priori, which is kind of a semi-problematic and mysterious sort of category things. And I said, well, it's probably not going to try to base the Eunomian premise on experience, and it's not a truth of logic, and I don't think he's going to say it's true by definition. So it's probably going to come down to these synthetic a priori claims. And the problem with those is there's no great way. I mean, there's what I said was just kind of two ways to support them. I mean, one is in some cases, some synthetic a priori claims like solve some sort of problem in metaphysics or something. And then in some cases, maybe they just follow logically from other synthetic a priori propositions. But so the question would be then, well, does the Eunomian premise solve some sort of puzzle? And no, that didn't happen. So the only other really, approach that you can take would be to either just beg the question and just say it's true, or show that it follows from some other synthetic a priori propositions that either, are essential to my worldview, or, if you're just addressing the audience, like maybe there are things that are widely assumed, but he didn't do any of that either. So basically at the end of it, there was no real support for the Eunomian premise, which is kind of what I expected.
I think the Jake left a lot to be desired, mainly because I think that he was not actually addressing the debate title,
Yeah.
and it seems like he has some kind of misunderstanding about how justification works, I guess, in terms of
Yeah, I
justifying
thought
evidence
that
we have.
was true in the debate and in his debate review. It seems like there was just problems with kind of keeping track of the burden of proof and how kind of the structure of justification works. Yeah.
Should we talk a bit about the nature of formal debates? I think that would be an important place
Yeah,
to
I
start.
think you had some things that you wanted to say about that. I think that'd be a good place to start.
Yeah, so I think that typically in a formal debate, you have an affirmation, an affirmative position,
Mm-hmm.
and a negation.
Mm-hmm.
And so there could be a debate title, like, for example, in this case, is it impossible to have the divine nature without aseity?
Right.
And so the person who's in the affirmative would have to argue, yes, it is
Yes, it's
impossible.
impossible. Yeah.
And then the other person would have to argue, no, it is not impossible,
Mm-hmm.
i.e., it's possible.
Right.
Um, and typically what happens is that one person makes an opening statement and the other person makes an opening statement, and
Mm-hmm.
then the rebuttals address those respective opening statements.
Yeah.
and whoever goes second can address stuff in the first rebuttal of the other person, and then you debate about that. It seemed like he really had this idea that if you didn't bring something up, then it was just fair game without asking you to mention whether or not it was something that you were going to uphold in the debate. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So there's a number of things there. So one, and I think this would make maybe give some context to help people understand this better. So in some discussion I had with Jake, it's been a while back now, but the Eunomian premise came up. So this proposition, it's impossible to have the divine nature without being absolutely assay. That's something I've called the Eunomian premise because Eunomius used it in his arguments against the doctrine of the Trinity. Because traditionally, the doctrine of the Trinity says, well, the Son is from the Father, the Holy Spirit is from the Father. So they're not absolutely assay, they're from the Father. So if you said you can't have the divine nature without being absolutely assay, that'd be a problem. So I suggested we could debate that topic. And then later, when he came back and wanted to kind of, hammer out a date and all that sort of thing, he kind of turned it into, he wanted to debate this modal ontological argument that I have for why, if the Eunomian premise, so if the Eunomian premise is true, then the doctrine of the Trinity is not going to work. But I have this argument that if the Eunomian premise is false, then you just automatically get a second divine person. And he kind of wanted to debate that. So my proposal was, why don't we do two different debates? And the way it would work would be the first debate will just debate the Eunomian premise, and he'll take the affirmative and say, yes, it's impossible to have the divine nature without aseity. And I figure if he met the burden of proof on that, then there wouldn't even need to be a second debate, right? Because then the doctrine of the Trinity would be false. So, there you go. But if not, then I would take the affirmative in the second debate, and I would give my modal argument, one premise of which is that the Eunomian premise is false. So then I'd have the burden of proof in that debate. And my view on it is, I don't think any of the objections that he has to my modal ontological argument are going anywhere. I think the only way that you can get around it is to get the Eunomian premise to be true. So I think it's kind of pointless, but I was willing to have this, other debate with him, and we would kind of divvy up the burden of proof that way. But yeah, instead of just having the first debate focus on the Eunomian premise, it was kind of like he wanted to flash forward and talk about the second debate topic during the first debate and kind of raise problems for that argument and so forth, which I still think didn't really go anywhere. But so yeah, there was this kind of lack of focus on the actual debate topic. I forgot what the second thing you said was, besides the burden of proof, and anyway, maybe it'll come back to me. But
Yeah,
yeah.
it might come back. Yeah, I think that this two debate thing makes sense because it's better to just debate one of those premises separately so that you don't get lost in the weeds about it in the next debate.
Yeah.
But it seemed like the strong concern to just front load all the arguments from what was supposed to be in that second debate into the first debate was really because of a concern of the fact that if he couldn't make a good case for the Eunomian premise on its own in the first debate, then your argument would basically just go through. And it seems to me he thinks that, if you negate the Eunomian premise, you just automatically get a second divine person. He seems to agree with the validity of the argument, and he seems to think that apart from that one premise, it's all sound. So that's, at least,
which it is.
It seems to be good news.
Yeah, and maybe we can go over some of that.
Well, I think what should be noted is just that there was such a concern over this that there just had to be a front loading of those arguments that were supposed to be in the second debate into this debate, which is unfortunate, and I think shows a testament to how good your argument is, to be honest with you. But I think, I think, you know how you have that paper, no new solutions to the logical problem of the Trinity?
Yeah.
I think you should write a paper after this debate called "No New Arguments for the Eunomian Premise."
No good arguments for the yeah. Well, I mean, I'm open to the possibility that there could be a good argument for it. Um, but the way that argument would have to work, I mean, again, you would either have to show that it solves some kind of puzzle or something, so there's value to believing it for its own sake, or you'd have to find other synthetic a priori propositions that it follows from, where those more basic premises are, for whatever reason, they're independently plausible.
Well,
And
yeah. So there was this strange idea that, well, I'm just pulling from Beau's worldview, his synthetic a prioris, like
well,
supposedly pulling from your synthetic a
yeah,
prioris. But I think this is kind of irrelevant because we're talking about synthetic a prioris that kind of you would both agree on, or things that most theists might believe in, right? That was my kind of understanding. But the synthetic a prioris he seemed to be trying to use were things that were basically, and we'll show this right when we go through the three arguments he was talking
mhm.
about. But yeah,
Yeah,
if you have any
that's
more
the
takes
thing
on
is,
that.
I mean, and yeah, in his debate review, this came up too. It was like it was something, you know, I don't know, like I was trying to weasel my way out of something or something like this. But yeah, I mean, you have to appeal to premises that your interlocutor accepts, or if you're not going to do that, I mean, it would be fine if he wanted to say, well, Beau just has weird, wacky metaphysics or something, and I'm just talking to the audience, and here's synthetic a priori propositions that most of the audience are going to accept, or just say, hey, ask yourself, do you believe X, Y, and Z? But the problem is yeah, that like nothing like that was really forthcoming. There's a lot of weird objections in this debate where it's like that he'd maybe object to something, um, but then like not follow through with it. So like one of the thing that came up was he was like, well, you could also know things about God based on revelation, and like that doesn't fit into the logical or analytic or synthetic or a posteriori. And it's like, well, okay, so let's add this category of divine revelation, but then you'd have to actually show me that there's some divine revelation of the Eunomian premise, or
It seemed to me you were just
propositions that
talking
lead to.
about. It seemed to me you were just talking about like in the context of natural theology.
Yeah.
Like that seemed that what you were saying.
Well, I was, but I mean, I'd be happy to add. I mean, I'm a little skeptical of whether this is a good idea, but I mean, we can add this other category, and let's say you don't think you can assimilate it to any of the other ones. Like, okay, fine, add it in, but then it's irrelevant unless you actually have some divine revelation that you're using or something, and that would take us into a whole other thing. You got to prove to me that the Quran is divine revelation, or you've had a divine revelation. I mean, so, but there were a number of these cases where it's like some kind of little point, was objected to, but in a way that wasn't really going to be relevant because he's not going to follow through with it.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about those three arguments, but yeah, it's just worth highlighting that he kept saying that he was making arguments for how the divine nature without aseity is inconsistent with laws of metaphysics, but he never gives
Right.
us a premise to conclusion argument with a certain law of metaphysics in
Right.
one of those premises, and how that actually
Yeah.
gives us some kind of contradiction.
Another kind of on that topic. Yeah, I guess we should do this first. So, one issue that I saw with a lot of his arguments was just it wasn't obvious that they were actually directed at the Eunomian premise, which was the debate topic, right? And also it seemed like they just kind of relied on auxiliary assumptions that I didn't really believe in. But at one point, I mean, he kind of responded like, well, they're supposed to be reductio arguments, right? Which, I mean, that's all fine and good. Like if you want to phrase your argument as a reductio, that's fine. But for the most part, that's just going to be equivalent. Like there are logical equivalences between just kind of a straight argument. Let me put it this way. And this actually is something that came up with a third argument. But so if you've got just a straight argument for a certain conclusion, you can always turn it into a reductio for the same conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So reductio arguments where you just assume the opposite of your conclusion and you show that a contradiction follows. And so you say, well, so that assumption must not have been correct, right? If you've got, if I say all men are mortal, Socrates is man, so Socrates is mortal, that's just a straightforward argument. It's not a reductio, right? I could turn it into a reductio by saying, well, assume Socrates isn't mortal, but all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, and so that's a contradiction. So my assumption must have been false, right? You can always turn that into reductio. You can't always turn a reductio argument into just a straightforward positive argument. It's one reason why people have developed like intuitionistic logic and relevance logics and things. And one problem that everyone knows with the way classical logic treats reductio arguments is that I can get a contradiction that's just completely irrelevant. And the format of a reductio argument will let me conclude whatever, right? So I could do something like assume Islam is true. Well, back in 2020 or whatever, when Joe Biden was first inaugurated, I have a tape recording where you said Joe Biden's a pretty good president. And then a few months ago, you said Joe Biden's not a good president. That's a contradiction. So since we assumed that Islam was true, and then we got this contradiction, Joe Biden's a good president, Joe Biden's a bad president, well, then we can show that Islam is false. But that's silly, right? Because the contradiction doesn't really follow from Islam as such, right? It's just a kind of random contradiction. And the problem is that, if you're trying to do a reductio, it's not necessarily going to be relevant. Like you have to make sure that it actually is relevant. Either it's something that follows from the negation of your conclusion, or it's like things that your interlocutor just really is committed to. Like in that case, like you could just say, well, yeah, I changed my mind. I don't think Joe Biden's a good president anymore. It's not that I'm really committed to this contradiction or like Islam entails. It's just that I happen to contradict myself or something. So, so anyway, I would just say this. If there is an argument, if there is just a straight valid argument for the Eunomian premise, so the conclusion is the Eunomian premise and it really is valid, and all of the premises are things that I actually believe, like just state that, right? Just articulate that argument, and I'll stop being a Trinitarian. I mean, I'm happy to stop being a Trinitarian if someone can prove the Eunomian premise is true. Then, I mean, I don't want to believe something that's false. So, so whatever, if there is an argument out there, which I don't think any of these were, just articulate it, right?
Yeah, please just.
Yeah, just state it.
It's been around long enough. Someone should be able to put it into a logical format.
I mean, that's part of what I was saying in my opening statement. Is it's like it's been 1,600 years. Seems like at some point you could sit down and just write it out, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not even about like having to have that. It's just like, can we have some clarity as to what exactly your argument is? Because, well, we're going to look at the arguments. So the first argument was this Assay Cow, or the nature of nature's argument.
Was the nature of nature's argument, wasn't it?
Right.
Right.
All right, we can just, we'll say there's like 4 arguments then. So let's say there's the nature of nature's argument. Yeah. So could you state the argument and then?
So so the nature of nature's argument was where he said, basically, so suppose the Father generates the Son. Natures are, I mean, the way I would put it is natures are individuated by the causal powers they bestow upon their bearers. And what he wanted to say is, well, the Father has this power to produce a divine person, and the Son can't produce a divine person. So they have different sets of causal powers, so they have different natures. And my response to, so that's the only one that he gave that I feel like I could get that into a valid form for something. It's still not totally clear that you get the Eunomian premise. It would have to be something like you would then generalize it to like any. It's not just the Father and the Son in Christian theology, but like any generated divine person, you'd have this problem or something. And I tried to kind of see if it would generalize, and it wasn't. It didn't just immediately generalize. So I'd have to work on what kind of auxiliary propositions you'd need to add in there. Maybe it can be done. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's just like it's not my job to go in and figure out, and especially like during a timed debate, like it's not my responsibility to go and figure out, well, how could I patch this argument up and like flesh it out and whatever. Like maybe if I was grading an undergraduate paper, I would, write some comments and here's the extra stuff you need to do, he'll kind of help you out. But anyway, I mean, you can get into a valid argument for something like the Father and the Son don't have the same nature. But it just relies on a complete misunderstanding of what the metaphysics of natures is supposed to be. So prior to the debate, we defined exactly how we're going to do the proposition, and we defined, since the proposition was it's impossible to have the divine nature without aseity. I sent Jake, here's my definition of nature, and here's my definition of aseity. And what I did is I sent him a quotation from Aristotle, book 2 of the Physics, where Aristotle defines the term nature. And I sent him another quotation from John of Damascus, where he basically quotes Aristotle on that. And I told him like this, this is from book 2 of the Physics, blah, blah, so it's not like there's any secret to it. Like I'm presupposing the Aristotelian view about natures, and it's just not the case that anytime two things have like any differences in causal powers or behaviors or something like that, then they just necessarily have different natures. Natures are a theoretical postulate in an Aristotelian system to explain certain kinds of activities that a thing can have. So a way, I don't want to spend a super long time on this because it's kind of just basic like ancient philosophy 101, but a way sometimes I explain this to my students is like, if you were an Aristotelian and a racist, then you might take two different guys, like you've got a black guy and a white guy over here, and like they like different music and they dress different and talk different and walk different or whatever. Well, if you're a racist, you'd say, yeah, I can explain why these two biological organisms behave different. That one's a black guy and that one's a white guy. And that's the explanation, right? To the racist explanation. But what that would be in Aristotelian terms is you would be positing the existence of a nature, right? You'd say there's a nature of black people and a nature of white people. And that's your, that's your view. If you're not a racist, what you would say is, well, there's just a human nature, and they both have the same human nature, and these little differences can be explained in terms of culture, in terms of upbringing. Right? If we had switched these guys at birth, and one grew up in one family and one grew up in the other family, then they would have picked up the same accent, they would have picked up the same mannerisms and so forth, right? It's just kind of learned behavior that's different, right? And at one point in his debate review, it was just kind of like, well, you can just take any difference out of the nature and say it's like an accidental thing or it's hypostatic or whatever. But I mean, an Aristotelian would just say, look, Sure. I mean, you could posit the existence of a different nature here. You could also say that, like, because some people can bench press more than others, then they're different biological species. Because one person can speak French and the other person can't. Different nature, different speed. I mean, you could say anything, like, because you've got more hair on your face, different nature. I mean, you could posit all these different natures if you hate Occam's razor and you just want to, like, postulate all these differences, right? But if if, like, I already know that there are cultural differences, there's difference in people's families and backgrounds. Some people have bigger muscles than others. Some people grow up in places where people speak French. Like, if I already know that those factors are there, then I just don't need to posit the existence of different natures, right? So it's not like it's just sort of anything goes. It's just that it's a more complicated view than he seems to think. And I gave the example. There's a few things wrong with this. So one is just that, and I gave the example of you could have a copper key and a copper wire. They would both have the same nature, but one has the ability to unlock a door because of its shape, not because of its nature. So you can have, point being, you can have behaviors and activities that are grounded in things other than in nature. Otherwise, you would have a weird thing. I mean, everyone would have a different nature. I think he didn't like the fact that the key is an artifact, but you could do it with a human being, right? You could say, well, look, one person can bench press however many pounds and this other person can't. It's not because they have different natures. It's because of the accident of the fact that one has bigger muscles, right? Another problem with the argument was, and I didn't really have time to get into this in the debate because there were like 3 different arguments, but the church fathers never really refer to begetting as an energia, an energy, which is what actually individuates natures. And probably the reason is something like this. When you're thinking about a nature in these Aristotelian terms, you're thinking about, like, physical cause and effect, right? So, like, fire by nature burns things, right? Earth by nature falls downwards and so forth. So you're thinking about kind of temporal cause and effect. And the relation between the Father and the Son isn't like a physical cause and effect. It's more like something like grounding, right? That people talk about today. Sometimes people call it metaphysical causation. Sometimes they call it grounding. So the church fathers don't refer to it as an energy. They just say it's a schesis. It's a relation. So strictly speaking, it's not really clear that begetting should count as like a difference in causal powers, because it's not really the right sense of causation. But I didn't want to get into all of that. But for people listening, if you want to know about the theology, like, I don't think that. I mean, again, the church fathers don't really refer to begetting as an energy. But even if you did just kind of assimilate that to an energy, it's not the case that just kind of any difference between 2 things gives you a different nature, any difference in terms of energies. I don't know if you had anything more to say on that, or.
No, not much more, to be honest. I mean, I think you've illustrated the point that one thing can have a different causal power, but have the same nature, and that's kind of that. And actually, he didn't have anything to say about that in his response.
Yeah, that was another thing. Is that he seemed to just
kind of
drop that.
dropped it.
So it was like, well, I mean, in a debate, you assume if the person just drops it, then that's it.
Yep.
They dropped it.
Would you like to talk about the Assay Cow argument?
Yeah. So then the Assay Cow argument, it was a little difficult for me to even kind of know how to reconstruct that, but basically, the idea was something like, if aseity, so suppose it's possible for it's possible to have the divine nature without aseity. So if aseity isn't necessitated by the divine nature, I think the idea was something like it wouldn't be necessitated by anything. And then, which that's already problematic. And then the next step was something like if there's nothing that necessitates God the Father being Assay, then somehow you could have something that was Assay and not divine, like a cow, right? So you could have an Assay cow, which doesn't follow logically. So I don't know. I mean, that was just like, I mean, there's no, that looks like there's none there. So let's talk about those two premises. So the first premise, I didn't really go into a lot of detail on this because the second premise seemed like a more straightforward one to object to. But the first premise is something like if the divine nature isn't necessitating aseity, then nothing would. But that's not the case in the context of the theology we're talking about. So just think about the idea here is that divine fatherhood, right? This generation of a divine person is God the Father's hypostatic property. And what a hypostatic property is what in contemporary analytic philosophy you would call an individual essence instead of a kind essence. It's a property that uniquely identifies one individual, right? So maybe, I mean, suppose you think since Adam was the first human, it wouldn't be possible for Adam, the individual, to have been born to Noah or something, right? Which plausibly, yeah, like I mean, maybe your parents are essential to you, or maybe it's essential to you that you have exactly the DNA that you have. Like if your parents had someone that had different DNA, like maybe that wouldn't really be you, right? So hypostatic property just kind of picks out a certain individual in any possible world. And the idea is that the generation of a divine person is God the Father's hypostatic property. That's what uniquely identifies him. So if you assumed that there was a possible world, this is an actual reductio. It actually follows from the assumption. So assume there's a possible world where the Father isn't Assay. So there's a possible world where he's generated by someone else, some other individual, right? Well, but that's his hypostatic property. So that individual would have God's hypostatic property. So they'd end up being identical. So you can't have a possible world where some other individual generates God the Father, or else that wouldn't be his hypostatic property anymore. So it doesn't need to be part of the divine nature. And the whole idea, the whole theology that we're talking about is this theology where fatherhood is God the Father's hypostatic property, right? So the thing is, if you wanted to really make good on this idea that if what was it? If the divine nature doesn't entail doesn't necessitate aseity, then nothing could, right? Then you have to at least address why you think that fatherhood can't be God's hypostatic property, right? But the problem is, like, he and I agreed that there's really only three possibilities, right? Either divine fatherhood is an impossible property, which is just the Eunomian premise, right? Right? You can't generate a divine person, or it's a hypostatic property, or it's a shareable property. And we both agree that if it was a shareable property, then you would just get infinitely many divine persons, because you could just keep multiple things can instantiate this property. So if he had so we agree to rule that out. So if he had an argument for why it couldn't be a hypostatic property, then that would just be a direct argument for the Eunomian premise, and you wouldn't even need the Assay Cow argument, right? So the only way to actually make the Assay Cow argument work is if you already have this independent argument that fatherhood's not God's hypostatic property, which just automatically gets you the Eunomian premise. So the only way to actually make the Assay Cow argument work is if you have another argument that would make the Assay Cow argument superfluous. So, so there's that. Like, that's one reason it's like, this doesn't, this argument just doesn't make any sense why you'd even give it. If you like, because again, I mean, if you did have this argument that in kind of in the background that would let you complete the Assay Cow argument, then you could have just given it. You could have just scrapped the Assay Cow argument and just given the good argument. And then the other thing was like, even if you wanted to go on with it and say, okay, if the divine nature doesn't necessitate aseity, then nothing does. His inference then was that then it would be possible to have something that doesn't have the divine nature and that is assay, and that's just not even logically valid. Maybe, I don't know, do you want to, would this be a good point to just kind of go through this validity checker thing that I...
Yeah, we'll do it for this one, and then we'll talk about the cross-examination a bit.
Okay. So, yeah, there we go. Okay, so you've got this proof. So this is a proof tree generator. Every now and then these things pop up on the internet and someone takes them down. But right now, this is actually the best one I think I've seen so far, and it's up now. So you can see the URL, whatever it is, www.umsu.de/trees. So basically, what a proof generator or validity checker does is just like if you're not good at math, you can use a calculator, right? And the calculator will solve a math problem for you. So it's the same thing here. Like if you're not good with logic, you can just use this proof generator and stick in a logical formula and check it and see if it's any good. So you don't have to take my word for it, right? You could just use this and figure it out. So this generator does what we call baby logic in at Notre Dame. So it's just kind of standard first order predicate logic. You've got let me see if I'll scooch over here. So you've got that symbol means not. This one means and. This is an or. That's if then. That's if and only if. This is a quantifier that just means all or for every. So you'd say for every x, x is f. This is the existential quantifier. So there is an x such that, whatever. And in predicate logic, we do things kind of backwards. So the predicate will be a capital letter and it goes first. And then the subject is a lowercase letter, or subjects are lowercase letters and they go afterwards. So you would read that as F, A is F. So it's backwards, right? So if I wanted to say like Fred is red, I would say, okay, there, Fred is red, right? So what this lets me do is just check things. So like here's, actually this one is something that's relevant to our discussion. If I didn't talk about the box and the diamond. So the box just means something is necessarily true, and this diamond means that it's possibly true. So what this formula says is if it's necessarily true that if P then Q, then if it's necessarily true that P, then it's necessarily true that Q, right? So if P is, like, let's say P was a fact about math, so it's necessarily true. And this is just saying that it's, Q is something that necessarily follows from P. Well, then Q is going to be necessarily true. And actually, it's, and also you can do this in this proof tree generator. So that symbol just means that this this set of propositions logically entails this proposition. So if we so let's say we said the Father is a necessary being, and if the Father exists then the Son exists, and that's necessarily true. Well, then the Son would be a necessarily existent being. So even though the Son is from the Father, right, he'd be a necessary being. So I guess to go on to his Assay Cow Argument. Let me kind of scroll forward a little bit on my notes here. I can find it. So basically, what you would do here. So let's say we wanted to say something is from another. I want to say X is from Y. Then I could write it like that. And so I would want to say that X is from another. I could say there exists a Y such that X is from Y, right? And if I want to say something is say, I can say there isn't anything that it's from, right? There does not exist a Y such that X is from Y. And so if I wanted to say, let's see. So here's a way you could state the Eunomian premise, right? And I'm going to put S5 in here, so I want that later. But the Eunomian premise would say it's not possible that there exists an X. And so, well, one thing I should have, let me go through this and I'll say why it is. So there exists, there is an X such that X exists, and X is divine, and X is from something, right? That's the Eunomian premise. So it says that there's an X that exists and is divine and is ab alio, or from something else. And the Eunomian premise is saying that's not possible. If you wanted to say that it is possible for there to be an X such that X exists and is divine and is from another, right? And you want to say, well, that entails that you could have something non-divine that is assay, right? Here, that would be this proposition. So it's possible for there to be something that exists and it's not divine, but it is not from something else, right? It's assay. And you can just see that you don't get the entailment. And I clicked this thing for S5. So there's different systems of modal logic. S5 is the strongest. So if you could get an entailment, you would definitely get it with S5, but you don't, and it'll give you a counter model here and so forth. So I tried to kind of give that was where I used the box, the infamous box, and I tried to kind of give a layman's explanation of why this isn't valid, but it just didn't seem to register with them. So I'll just say this, like here it is. You can see on this validity checker, like that isn't a valid argument. So we had the first argument, the nature of nature's argument. I think maybe you could get it into a valid form for something, but it relies on just a total misreading of Aristotelian metaphysics. The second argument is just not even valid. And I mean, you'd have to back it up with an argument that would make it superfluous in the first place.
This is all because something else other than the divinity can entail aseity. Is that right?
Yeah, because the fact that fatherhood is, and actually I can do that on here too. Let's see, I've got some notes here. So let me see. Let me move this screen out of the way as my screen's cluttered kind of. So here's how you would say the ability to generate a divine person is God's hypostatic property, right? So you say necessarily for any X, if X exists, then there's a Y such that Y exists and Y is divine and Y is from X, right? So X is generating a divine person if and only if X is F, X is the father, right? So in other words, it's saying in any possible world, if you're talking about something that exists in any possible world, it can generate this divine person if and only if that's the Father. Only the Father and only the Father can generate a divine person. If we just add, so if we add a few things here, so this would say that only a divine person can generate a divine person. So if x, so for any x, if there's a y such that y exists and is divine and is generated by x, then x exists and x is divine, right? So in other words, only an existent divine person could generate an existent divine person. And then if we assume what seems plausible, nothing can generate itself, right? And then the Father, God the Father, is necessarily existent, right? Then that just entails that necessarily the Father is Assay, right? Necessarily there doesn't exist anything such that the Father is from that thing, right? And it'll sometimes this thing kind of takes a little while and chokes up, but there you go. So you can see, like, yeah, those premises entail the conclusion. So the question is, right, if you want to say, like, oh, there's just no way that you could get aseity being necessitated by anything else, then which one of these premises would Jake want to deny? Would he want to say that God is not a necessarily existent being? I mean, that's kind of the point of his third argument, which we'll get to in a second, was he wanted to, he thought if he could get me to say that God didn't necessarily exist, then that would be a big problem. Does he want to say that things can generate themselves? I mean, that besides just seeming to be absurd, like it's a part of the cosmological argument, the contingency argument, that nothing can generate itself. So presumably he doesn't want to get rid of that. And this one, like if you said that it was possible for there to be something that is not divine and does generate a divine person, well, that would just automatically show that the Eunomian premise actually is false. So that would just wreck his view in the first place. So he shouldn't want to say that. So the only thing that's left is to deny that that fatherhood is God's hypostatic property, right? But again, if you had an argument for that, then you just wouldn't need the Assay Cow argument, right? You just if divine fatherhood can't be God's hypostatic property, then I already admit that it can't be a non-hypostatic property, it can't be a shareable property. So you just automatically get the Eunomian premise. So he'd have to have an independent way of showing that that's true.
Yeah. Well, let's actually just show, because in the cross-examination,
yeah,
he's cross-examining you about this, and he's making he makes a flat-out logical fallacy, and yeah, let's just show it, because lots of he's managed to convince people that, oh no, but it's really clear. Look, I'm gonna add this to the stream. Just listen carefully, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm saying, why is it that the divine nature somehow has an Assay person within it, but a cow or a rock does not?
That a cow or a rock can't be Assay.
Yes.
So notice he's asking Beau why he's agreeing, like, why can't a cow, i.e. a contingent being, be Assay?
Do you think that they can be?
No, I mean, I would take it that a contingent being, I mean, I believe in the principle of sufficient reason, right? So a contingent being would have to have a cause.
But why is it contingent?
So you say that a contingent being has to have a cause, and so now he's he's asking you why would a certain being be contingent?
Why are cows contingent?
Yeah, or rocks or anything else.
So I mean, they're physical objects. They're made up of physical parts, right? So you can take a cow and cut it up and cook it and eat it, right?
And he laughs here, but I mean, you're just making the point that these things can fail to exist, which is a perfectly reasonable justification for believing that something is contingent.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
still didn't get that. Yeah, I mean, it usually the way these kinds of like contingency arguments go is that people think, yeah, I can just kind of see that, like, cows are the sorts of things that you can destroy. They're the sorts of things that don't have to always exist. There are times when they don't exist. There are places where they don't exist. And so, it's just like the first step is to say, well, it looks like these things are contingent. And then you assume this synthetic a priori premise that if something is contingent, then it needs to have a cause of some sort, needs to be grounded or caused or explained or something.
Mm-hmm.
Can't be absolutely assay. And then you infer that, okay, so it has a cause, and then you can't go back infinitely far, then you've got to get to a first cause that's not caused, right? And yeah, he seemed to want to say that it works in like the opposite direction. Like you start with the idea that it's caused and then infer that it's contingent. Which number one, like, it is just logically kind of gets things backwards, but also he later contradicted himself on that point, which we can get to at the end if you want.
Can you still see the video like this?
Yeah.
Okay.
So does that have anything to do with the nature of the cow?
Yeah.
So you affirm that the contingency of the cow is entailed by its nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is my point. Is that right? So this is my point. Is that the nature of the rock and the cow have to do with why it is contingent and couldn't be assay.
Mm-hmm.
So you agree that it's the nature of the rock and the cow that entail the contingency of the rock and the cow. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So then the reverse of that, why would right? But then exactly. But then that would mean the reverse should also be true. But you're saying it's not. That
see, that's the fallacy.
Yeah,
that's the fallacy right there. That the reverse has to be true.
Yeah. So what he wants is, so let's see. He wants to get the Eunomian premise, right? So it's impossible to have the divine nature without aseity, and he, I guess, wants to say what that's entailed by what the fact that it's not possible to have something that's not divine but not ab alio, and that's just not valid.
Oh, wait, let me put your logic tree up.
Oh yeah, sorry, I put one up there. Yeah, so here, right? So this would be saying it's not possible for there to be something that exists and is non-divine, and it's assay, right? So it's not possible to have an assay cow or anything else that's not divine. And then he wants to say that entails that it's not possible to have something that exists and is divine and is not assay, right? But that's not, I mean, there you go, in case you didn't. Boom. Boom. Right, not valid. So yeah, I just, it's like, it's not even valid. And I tried to explain that in kind of, simple-ish terms in the debate. And
well, you also talked about, and you could talk about this now a bit, is the difference between something that by nature requires a cause and something just that happens to have a cause, and how this figures in.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, during the debate, I gave this example that, a carnivore is the sort of thing that requires meat. But if you're not a carnivore, it's not that you're required to not eat meat. It's just you're not required to eat meat or not, one way or the other. Right. So a non-carnivore could be an omnivore. It could be a vegetarian, but it could be an omnivore. Right.
Right. So in this case, the rock and the cow, they have a nature such that they require a cause.
Right.
But the sun just happens to have a cause.
Right. In other words, I mean, this is kind of equivalent to just saying, necessarily anything that's exists and is non-divine must have a cause, right? But that doesn't show that the Eunomian premise is true, right? That doesn't show that. I mean, what equivalently here, what Jake is trying to say is that necessarily, if something exists and is divine, then it can't possibly have a cause. But again, that's just not valid. And those are just equivalent ways of kind of saying the same thing. So it just isn't valid. And I mean, yeah, I mean, maybe there's some other propositions that you could stick in there to get it to work, right? But unless he articulates, like, I can't think of what they would be. And so unless he articulates something, but he seemed to just think like this was just straightforward logical entailment. Or I guess maybe he thinks like it's just sort of like, I think some of what was going on with him was like a misunderstanding of the principle of sufficient reason or something. Like it was almost like if he couldn't immediately think of a reason why the Father would necessarily be Assay, then he just can't be necessarily Assay. Or if he can't think of a reason why something would be true, then it just wouldn't be true or something. That was part of what came up with. So I forget which argument this was part of, but he would try to say like, either there's just one divine person, or there's infinitely many divine persons, or there's an arbitrary number of divine persons. And it's like, he never really said what arbitrary meant, but if arbitrary means like, I personally can't see why something would be true, like that's not how the principle of sufficient reason works, right? It's not that you just personally can't see something. It has to be that it really, it really isn't necessarily true. I thought, I might give an example here, a couple of examples of why that issue doesn't really work either. I guess that was part of the nature of nature's argument, actually. But so there's all kinds of things. So anything any mathematical truth is going to be necessarily true. It's a necessary truth. But there's all kinds of mathematical facts where you have an arbitrary number of things, that satisfy a certain logical operation, or that are solutions to a certain equation or something like that. So like some famous ones, semi-famous, I guess. If you take, like, suppose you take a number and you take the cube of that number, and then you add all of the digits in its, base 10, representation. So you add all the digits up, and then you square that number, and then you take all of those digits and then cube all of those digits and add those cubes together. And then do you get the original number? And it turns out that that's an operation that works for exactly two numbers, and they're not numbers you would expect. It's the number 666 from the Mark of the Beast, and 2,583. So I mean, like, is that arbitrary? It's necessarily true. It's true that those two numbers will satisfy that operation, and no other numbers will. There's other things too, like you can take 666 and so like 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 cubed plus 6 cubed plus 6 cubed equals 666. And there's 5 other numbers that do that. So there's 6 numbers that do that. Is that arbitrary? I mean, it's certainly if arbitrary just means like I don't see why it's true, then if you're not, a really great mathematician or something, it's probably not going to be obvious to you why that's true. If arbitrary means something like any number between 1 and infinity, well, there are necessary truths about the numbers of things that are quote unquote arbitrary. They're somewhere between 1 and infinity, and it might not be obvious why, but there are reasons why. But if what arbitrary means is there literally is no reason why something should be true, then you have to go in and show that there's no argument for it, right? If I wanted to say like, well, having 2 numbers or 6 numbers that satisfy these equations, that's just arbitrary. There's no proof for it. Well, then I would need to go in and show that there's no proof for it. And we didn't get that, right? We didn't get that there's no reason why the Father would be Assay. In particular, again, if fatherhood's his hypostatic property, then he will be Assay. So
and just to reaffirm, like, this is a formal logical fallacy on his part. Just to repeat, he straight up says the nature has to do with why the rock and the cow are contingent, and because they're contingent, they can't be Assay. And his logical fallacy is to then say, well, the reverse should also be true.
Yeah.
If something can't be Assay, then it's contingent. Like, that's a formal fallacy.
Yeah. There's the contingency. No, wait, say that again. If something's contingent, then
it can't be Assay. Therefore, the reverse is true. If something can't be Assay, then it's contingent.
Right, so here would be some. So this would say necessarily anything that's ab alio is contingent. And so I would affirm that anything that's ab alio, or no, I wouldn't affirm that. Sorry, he wants that to be his conclusion, right? So he wants to say if something is ab alio, then it's contingent. And what I would say would be, I would say that if something is
contingent, then it's ab alio.
Contingent, then it's ab alio, right? But that's not going to be valid, right?
Yeah.
And that is just a straightforward. I mean, it's a very simple, like it's inferring the logical converse. It's just an instance of if A then B, so if B then A, and that's something you go over in like the first few weeks of a formal logic course or something. You would go over why that's a fallacy. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to say again, like, this whole thing of not actually making a positive case comes out in also the debate he had with Khalil, but we'll just put a pin in that for now.
I'm glad you mentioned. Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned the thing about Khalil too. So I think I reached out to Khalil, and he and I might do some kind of review, because I noticed that in between those two debates, he seems to have taken contradictory positions, and I would say that I'll save this for if Khalil and I do something together. But basically, like, he'd have to give up one of his arguments against Khalil, or give up an argument against me, because
we'll talk about this at the end.
Yeah. But also this thing about this issue with so contingent. So the ab alio beings have to be contingent in his view. So that would say if something's ab alio, right, then it's not necessarily existent. It's contingent. And during the debate, he kept asserting this at various points. But then during the cross-examination, he contradicted that proposition and affirmed that there are things that are not absolutely Assay, but that exist necessarily. So
let's talk about that at the end. We'll talk about the cross-examination. Yeah, if that's okay, because it will wraps up in a nice neat bundle. Let's talk about the other two arguments. So the contingency of the father argument, right?
Right. Yeah, that was the worst. So I mean, it's interestingly, I mean, these got kind of progressively worse. Like the first one, I could sort of see it's valid, and like maybe it could be something about the Eunomian premise, but just faulty misunderstanding of Aristotelian metaphysics. This second one just wasn't even valid, and if you tried to support it, you'd have to have an argument that would make it end up being superfluous anyway.
Oh, I'd like
third
to note
one,
as well. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you, but like
sure.
when you respond to him about the nature of nature's argument, I remember as well. He kind of goes like in his one of his rebuttal. He's like, well, I could just deny the whole notion of natures, and it's like, okay, I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
seems like a trivial, yeah, Pyrrhic
um,
victory.
so yeah, I mean, you'd just be saying it's impossible to have the divine nature without aseity because it's impossible to have the divine nature because there's not a divine nature.
Right, exactly. It's
Yeah,
silly,
well,
and
maybe let's come back to that because I want to say, well, I guess this is this is actually a good place to say this. So because it does tie into this objection. So he made this objection to like a video that I made a year ago or so, where and again, this is you know this one I can't even see, like I can't even imagine how you could make it an argument for the Eunomian premise. Um, it just seemed like an argument, and it wasn't obvious to me that you could make it into an argument um, against my other argument, my modal ontological argument for a second divine person, which is what he was kind of trying to flash forward to the second debate and talk about the second debate during the first debate. Um, so I don't think it is an argument for anything. And I mean, basically, it was just an argument against a certain definition of intrinsic and extrinsic properties. And I can tell. I mean, he seems very upset about this all, but I still don't get why he thought that this was some sort of devastating objection or something like that. But the argument was this: that in this video, I mean, I didn't even mention this during our debate, but in this video from like a year ago, I used a particular definition of intrinsic and extrinsic properties to just kind of demarcate the difference between the divine nature and then the question about being assay or ab alio. So in that video, I mentioned David Lewis and Ray Langton have a paper on defining the intrinsic extrinsic distinction. And what they say is their definition of it is that an intrinsic property is one where it's possible to have it even if nothing else exists. It's possible to lack it even if nothing else exists. And then it's possible to have it when other things do exist, and it's possible to lack it when other things do exist. So in other words, they want to say it's a property that having it or lacking it would be completely independent of what other things exist. That's the basic idea. And I said, if you think about it, God's nature is intrinsic, right? Because you can't, because it's something that he could have. A thing could have or lack regardless, right? A nature in general is intrinsic, and aseity is extrinsic, or being ab alio is extrinsic because it depends on there being something else, right? You can't be ab alio or lack aseity unless something else exists, right? And that was just kind of to kind of show the distinction between the nature and the aseity, and to say it's a little bit mysterious why you would think that the divine nature would entail aseity, because one's an intrinsic property and one's an extrinsic property. Maybe they do. I mean, maybe there's some synthetic a priori, reason why they would, but it's a little bit of a mystery, right? Well, so Jake gave an argument basically just against those definitions or that definition, and I just kind of accepted the argument because it seemed like a reasonable point, but it doesn't have anything to do with I mean, it doesn't in any way obviously entail the Eunomian premise. So his argument was just that given the way that they define intrinsic, basically you either, if you have necessarily existent entities like God or like numbers or whatever properties, anything you think might be necessarily existent, sets, if you have a necessarily existent being, then it just turns out that nothing is an intrinsic property, right? Because you can't have any property without something else existing if there are necessarily existent beings. And conversely, if there are any intrinsic properties, then you would have to say there's no necessary beings. And I mean, I just said, yeah, I mean, that's a fair criticism of those definitions. And so I just said, yeah, that's right. Those are bad definitions. but it's like, how do we get from that's a bad definition for the intrinsic extrinsic distinction to it's impossible to have the divine nature without aseity? I mean, here's the thing, right? Like, even if I just, so what I actually did is I just said, well, I'll just tweak the definition. So instead of talking about what's metaphysically necessary or metaphysically impossible, you just switch it to talking about what is analytic or synthetic, because even if there are necessarily existent beings, even if their existence is necessary, it's not going to be analytic, right? It's not analytic that God exists. It's not analytic that numbers exist. Analytic just meaning true by definition, right? So I would just say, look, an extrinsic property is one where either having it or lacking it requires that something exists or requires that something not exist by definition, right? Rather than saying it's, rather than allowing synthetic a priori necessities to come in, I'll just say, well, if it's analytic that something else has to exist or something else can't exist when you have this property or lack this property, then that's an extrinsic property. And then you get the result, right, that being ab alio, it is an extrinsic property, because by definition, to be from another requires that there be another, right? But you don't get this problem with, you can't have intrinsic properties if there are necessary beings, because it's not analytic that if I, am square or round or red, then God exists. It's not analytic that God exists. It might be necessary that he does, but it's not true by definition. So that seems to me like that fixes the problem, and just everything else kind of goes through just the same. But the thing that I don't get, though, he seemed really upset about it or something. But even if you just didn't have a distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic properties, or if I just said, okay, I'll say that being ab alio and being assay are intrinsic properties somehow, I don't think that's very plausible. But even so, right, that doesn't show that the divine nature entails aseity, right? So I have intrinsic properties, like my height is an intrinsic property, but it's not necessary that anything that has human nature has the same height. My color is an intrinsic property, but not all humans have to have the same color, same height, same weight, same shape. Sorry, I got getting spam calls here. So yeah, it just doesn't. It just isn't really necessary. And maybe here, maybe we can go back to the.
Well, can I mention something as well? Is that he
Yeah.
he really seems to think you have to do this kind of huge mea culpa over the fact that you dropped this definition, which is just weird, because it's like, look, it's like he brought it up in the debate. You didn't, right? Because it wasn't even the topic of the debate.
Yeah.
Maybe in the next debate,
Yeah.
you would have provided a definition for extrinsic and intrinsic, and he could have attacked that or whatever. But if you didn't bring it up, then in the debate, you don't have to defend what you didn't bring up in the debate. Or if he asks you if you hold to something,
about
then,
about reductio is like just appealing to random stuff. Like, here's this thing from a video you did a year ago, and I'm going to bring it in, but it's like, but it doesn't actually follow from the Eunomian premise or the negation of the Eunomian premise that Lewis and Langton's definitions of intrinsic and extrinsic have to be true.
Well, he also makes it sound like the well, one thing I'll say is that he actually drops it once you say that you want to go with an analytic approach to the distinction.
Right.
He just kind of drops it. He doesn't go back to it. He seems to just let that B.
Yeah.
And even in the debate review, they have nothing to say about it. They bring it up, but
Yeah,
they don't
yeah,
really
they brought
say
it
anything
up and
about
then
it.
just kind of went past it. Like, and it seems to me like, I mean, it's important because it does seem like, look, the argument that he gave has nothing in particular to do with God. In fact, Lewis and Langton bring this issue up. They say, like, well, what about if there, if there is a God that exists necessarily, or numbers, abstract objects, sets, right? I mean, it's something that they kind of, mention, but they go past it. But yeah, I mean, it's just a problem with their definition. And the problem is not, again, it's not about God specifically, because it would be the same for an atheist who just believes in abstract objects, right? Like they would have to deal with that issue too. And the problem is just that it's a problem with the definitions when you have anything that exists necessarily, then you can't have an intrinsic property with that definition. So you have to have some way to deal with that. And what I'm saying is, well, the reason that becomes a problem is because you might think that there are these entities that exist necessarily, but it's not going to be analytic that they exist, right? It's not analytic that numbers exist or sets exist or properties exist or that God exists. It might be a necessary truth, but that's your metaphysics, right? So that's a synthetic a priori claim. So if you switch these definitions to just dealing with whether a proposition is analytic or synthetic rather than necessary or possible, then it does cut out that problem. It breaks that link. So it to me seems like, I mean, maybe there are other problems with their definition, but that problem seems like it just gets fixed by switching from necessity to analyticity and possibility to being synthetic. And they just never responded to that. Like either in the debate or his debate review, he never responded to it.
Well, the thing is, as well, is that the problem with the definition isn't like super fundamental, in terms of its intuition. So they make it seem like you're basically having to go back to the drawing board with your whole argument because this definition is, oh, well, what am I going to do now?
Yeah,
But the fact of
but
the
in
matter
reality, it's completely irrelevant. So let's do this. Let's share the screen again and let me go through. So here's the way that my my argument works. So I kind of, here's kind of a standard version of the modal ontological argument. So this says, the way I've said it is just, it's not possible for there to be something that exists and is divine, but it's not necessarily existent, right? It's just a contingent being, or it's not necessarily divine, so it's only contingently divine. In other words, I'm just saying, if something, if there exists in any possible world, if there exists a divine being, then that thing is going to be essentially divine, and it exists in all possible worlds. It's not going to be contingent, right? It's not going to be contingently existent or contingently divine. And that's just kind of the standard way to formulate this modal ontological argument. The second premise just says it's possible for there to exist something that is divine. And what that does is it entails that necessarily there exists something that is divine. And if you want to look at the proof, right, it'll give you a proof of it. So I went into more detail on this in my other videos and stuff, but anyway, that's a standard sort of way to do the modal ontological argument. What I point out is just if the Eunomian premise turns out to be false, then there's a handful of ways that you can kind of construct an argument for the existence of two divine individuals. So let me just scroll down here. So this conclusion says necessarily there's an X and a Y such that X exists and Y exists. X is divine, Y is divine, and X is not identical to Y, right? That's that little symbol's the not operator. So that means, in other words, there's two things. X and Y are two different things They both exist. They're both divine. And all of that is true in every possible world. Okay. So one way to do it is to say, okay, I'll just take that first premise from the standard ontological argument. So there's something, so it's not possible for a divine being to just be contingently existent or contingently divine. One way to run the argument, there's a number of ways, but as we go through them, just think about whether it matters whether aseity is intrinsic or not. This says it's necessarily anything for any x, if x is assay, right? It's not from something else, then it's necessarily assay. So that's just saying that that aseity it's always necessary to whatever has it. And keep in mind that on my view, right, the Father is assay, but he's necessarily assay, right? So that's seems like a plausible principle. And this says it's possible for there to exist a divine person that is assay, right? Which they would want to grant because God is assay, right? And it's possible for there to exist a divine person that's not assay, right? So that's the negation of the Eunomian premise. So all that's going on here is you've got the first premise from the modal ontological argument. And then instead of the second premise where you say it's possible for there to be a divine person, you say, well, it's possible for there to be a divine person that's assay, and it's possible for there to be a divine person that's not assay, that's abalio. And then you say it's a necessary truth that if something is assay, then it's necessarily assay. And that gets you the conclusion, it takes a while sometimes, but that gets you the conclusion that necessarily there are two divine persons. Another way, though, a sort of simpler way to do it would be, again, so you again start with the first premise from the standard ontological argument, and you say it's possible for there to be a being that's not absolutely assay, or that is ab alio. That's, again, the negation of the Eunomian premise. And then you just add the principle that only a divine being could produce a divine being, right? So necessarily for any x, if there's a y, that y exists and y is divine and y is from x, right, then x has to exist and be divine, right? So only an existent divine person could produce a divine person. And then necessarily nothing produces itself. So that also gets you two divine persons. Well, probably sometimes this thing kind of slows down.
I just want to finish on the
well, let me do the let me just kind of do the last few of these, so you can see it's generating a proof. I'll let that run, but so here's one where you take the first premise of the modal ontological argument and say the Eunomian premise is false, and just sort of directly say the Father exists necessarily, and he's divine necessarily, and he's assay necessarily. That also gets you, and most simply, if you want to do it really, really simply, just take the first premise of the modal ontological argument and just say there's a possible world where something is divine and assay and something is divine and abalio, right? And that gets you that there's two divine persons. And so notice, though, that like in none of that do you have to assume that aseity is an extrinsic property or an intrinsic property. None of that says anything about intrinsic or extrinsic properties, right? So I mean, even if I just decided to say, okay, well, I guess aseity is an intrinsic property after all, it wouldn't affect the modal argument that I'm going to give for two divine persons, or which I would have given if we had stuck to the script and actually just debated one topic and then the other. So it just wouldn't matter. And it doesn't give you the Eunomian premise. Like to say that aseity and the divine nature are both intrinsic doesn't mean that one will entail the other. So it just, the overall, I mean, you can kind of see, like, if I had gotten into this other argument, there's a number of ways to formulate it. they all basically just presuppose that the standard ontological argument is sound, and then you just add that the Eunomian premise is false, and then you have to add, one more thing in to kind of make sure that the Father and the Son don't end up being identical. So either you say they both exist in one possible world, or you saw the few things today. So basically, I mean, but those things are pretty much uncontroversial. So it just boils down to, if the Eunomian premise is false, then you're going to get a second divine person. And I mean, the stuff about it being intrinsic or extrinsic is, I think maybe people don't get this, that like, I mean, I'm just, using this proof generator so you can kind of see that, I'm not making it up. Like, it really does follow. But a lot of times things are not obvious to people. And so there's a pedagogical value in going through a proof or an argument in a way that's more complicated than is actually necessary, right? So frequently in math and in logic, there's like a simple way to prove something, but it's not very intuitive. And so it's not very helpful if you're just kind of expositing it for people, right? And I think that Jake must have kind of thought that some of the stuff that's just kind of exposition and it helps to explain things or whatever, it was like essential to the argument, and it's just not. The argument is very simple, and it's just the Eunomian premise. If the Eunomian premise is true, then Trinitarianism, at least traditional Trinitarianism, is going to be false. But if the Eunomian premise is false, then you get a second divine person.
Yeah. Well, I'd also like to say, even on the definition, like the definition itself, the basic intuition of the definition is still the case. Like, it carries over into the analytic exposition
of intrinsic and extrinsic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
I
think it's and also, yeah, I mentioned this during the debate, that like, it's not like Langton and Lewis just came along and stipulated, like, here, we're going to use this, definition to mean intrinsic. There's already a pre-existing concept of intrinsic and extrinsic that features in lots of philosophical arguments, and they were just attempting to characterize it, or they're attempting to define it more precisely, I guess. But the way to characterize it is just an intrinsic property is one that only has to do with you, or it only has to do with the thing that has that property. And an extrinsic property is one where that property is something that's true about you, but it's true at least partly in virtue of things distinct from yourself, right? So, typical examples of intrinsic properties would be like being square, being round, being red, being green. Those are things that it's just about the thing itself. It doesn't matter what other things exist or are related to it. Being a father would be an extrinsic property because it's about there being something else. Being a creator is an extrinsic property because it's about there being something else, right? Being a son or daughter, brother, sister. Some people just kind of characterize it as the distinction between relations and non-relational properties. The only reason that, I mean, not the only reason, but anyway, the reason that people don't just, they're not necessarily satisfied with that, is it seems like there are cases where you can bear a relation to yourself. So like identity plausibly is a relation, but you bear it to yourself, so it's intrinsic. Like I would have the property of being identical to Beau Branson regardless of what else exists. So it doesn't quite map onto just the difference between a relation and a monadic property, but it's close, and people just want to try to figure out, well, what is the distinction, and how can we
Well, yeah, so I guess my question would be to just ask Jake, like, do you reject the intrinsic extrinsic distinction?
Yeah.
And if you don't, then can you provide a definition for an intrinsic and an extrinsic property, please?
Yeah, that's another thing, is even if he wants to just focus on this issue, which again, it's not really essential to the argument anyway, but yeah, like he needs to give a different definition where you don't get this problem. And he needs to give a
admittedly, the
definition
distinction is
where-
relevant.
Yeah, and he needs to give a definition where that definition does get you the result that aseity is intrinsic. Although, like I said, I mean, even then, it doesn't really affect the argument. But if he's really kind of hung up on this, then he needs to give some other definition where you get the results that he wants. Because if it turns out that, well, I should just take one of the other many definitions that people have offered for this, if being assay and being ab alio still end up being extrinsic, then who cares? I mean, the whole thing was just a pointless discussion.
Yeah, I think the intrinsic extrinsic distinction, you did invoke it in the opening statement to argue that the Eunomian premise is false.
Yeah, so I will use it as part of an argument that the Eunomian premise is false. But again, I mean, even if you knock that out, right, it doesn't show that the Eunomian premise is true.
Yeah, so yeah, if it's like if aseity is an intrinsic property, then the Eunomian premise might be true, but it doesn't just automatically follow.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm looking forward to a definition from Jake in a paper published in Analytical or something.
Right.
Infinite divine persons argument, and then we'll talk about the cross.
Yeah, that was I think kind of a backup to the nature of nature's argument. So the nature of nature's thing again was where he said, well, if the Father produces a divine person and the Son doesn't, then they would have a different nature, which just doesn't follow. That's not how the metaphysics works. But what that kind of followed up with was then if the Son did generate a divine person, so let's put it this way: if it's part of the nature of a divine person to generate another, right? Then okay, you have the Father generating the Son, and then since the Son has the divine nature, he has to generate a third person. That person has to generate a fourth person, and so on to infinity. And that seems crazy, right? And to that, I mean, I say, yeah, that seems crazy. So that seems like a good reason to think that generating a divine person isn't part of or entailed by the divine nature. But again, I mean, I think it's a hypostatic property. So there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just.
And on the point about the different divine persons, like posit that it's not shareable and it's not part of the divine nature.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to generate a divine person.
Mm-hmm.
Then you would have as many divine persons as could be individuated by the relations, right?
Yeah, so that's the other thing. He wanted to get into this. I think he misunderstands the conclusion of this argument that I didn't present, because that was what I would have been talking about in the debate, right? So, I mean, which is, it is this weird, like, this kind of mashing stuff together. But he thinks that this hypothetical argument I would have given in the second debate, I guess, is supposed to prove the doctrine of the Trinity, like full on, the whole night. So that there are at least three divine persons. There's at most three divine persons, and that's a necessary truth, and so forth. But that's not what so actually I can, maybe I can share my screen on this, but that's not what the argument says. Let me see if I can do. I'll stop sharing that, and then I'll just share my whole. Oh, here we go. Yeah, I can do it this way. So, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so here's the slides that I used for this presentation I did. I guess I did it on your. So let's see.
Well, I'd also like to mention that he says that in the in the video we mention his name several times. In actual
Yeah.
fact, we mention his name twice,
Yeah.
and the one time I mention it is because I wanted to just mention, because he brings the point up about the Langton. What was it, Langton Lewis? He brings the point up
Mhm.
about something. I think it was this actually, and so I was just saying, well, he brought this argument up, but the stream was just about the arguments. I guess no good deed goes unpunished. Maybe I should just never mention him when I think he makes an argument from now on, and just
Yeah,
use them in a vacuum. And the other time was just because you were referring to a discussion between him and Josh and Mullins on his channel, and so it's kind of weird for him
oh
to
yeah,
just be like, "Why you mentioned me several times?" Like
several
the video
times.
wasn't about him.
Yeah, that maybe is a confusion too. So this argument that I worked on for this, argument for a second divine person, is something I developed in response to a paper by Dale Tuggy, who's a Unitarian Christian philosopher. And but I mean, basically, the backstory is just a lot of people have tried to use perfect being theology to argue for a second or third divine person. So they'll do things like say, well, God is perfectly loving, so he needs to have some other being there to love. Or, God is whatever. Maybe they'll say being a person requires there to be, you have to be related to other persons or something. So they given these arguments for, a second divine person or three divine persons. And Dale just, criticized them all and said, well, all these things rely on properties that either are not obviously essential to God, or it's not clear that they really require a second divine person. And I kind of agree with most of his criticism. So what I was doing was saying, well, look, you can take, piggybacking off of perfect being theology. Most perfect being theologians believe in this, the soundness of the ontological argument, the modal ontological argument. And I'm just saying, look, you don't need like sort of extra stuff. It just, if it's possible for there to be an ab alio divine being, then there necessarily will be. But the title of Dale's paper was on the possibility of a single perfect person. And he wants to argue that that's possible, that there's just a single perfect person, a single divine being. And all I'm trying to do is say that if there's a single divine person, then there's going to be a second one, right? So if you look at this, if you look at the slides here, I give a kind of, and this, like I said, on this slide, it will seem awkward because for pedagogical purposes, it's valuable to state it in a way that's a little bit weird, but it shows you kind of the parallel. So I gave a standard version kind of the standard modal ontological argument. And then here's this argument for the existence of a second divine person. But look at the conclusion, right? The conclusion is necessarily there's a being with all of the properties in this set that I defined. And so that set, SG, is defined as the union of I, which is all of God's essential intrinsic properties, and the unit set of the property of being ab alio. Okay, so in that case, the way I defined it requires that you make this distinction between being intrinsic and extrinsic. But as I showed you, you don't need to do it that way. You can just boil it down to just the negation of the Eunomian premise. So, for purposes of exposition, it's convenient to do that. But if you want to actually wreck the argument, you've got to deal with just the Eunomian premise. But anyway, the conclusion of the argument, right, is just there's going to be a being with all of those properties. And so if you think there's going to be a being with all of God the Father's properties, right, that is Assay, which Jake and Dale Tuggy and anybody else who's a theist is going to believe, well, you've also necessarily got the existence of this being that is just like God, except ab alio. So that the point of that's only supposed to show two divine persons, right? That's the only the conclusion of the argument. It's only intended to show that there will be a second divine person. And again, to to kind of go back to, if I can share this this thing again. So to go back here, right, the conclusion in this kind of simpler, more streamlined version. Oops. So you can see that where it's highlighted. The conclusion is just necessarily there exists an X and a Y such that they're both existent, they're both divine, and they're not identical, right? So there's two divine persons. So that's all it's intended to show, is that there's at least two. And actually, I guess I can do this. So this would say, this little formula would say there's three divine persons, or it's possible. Or sorry, this says it's not possible for there to be three divine persons. Okay, so let's just take like the first version that I gave and see, does it entail that there couldn't be three? No, right? It doesn't entail that there couldn't be three. Here's here's a formula that would say there's four divine persons, right? W, X, Y, and Z. They all exist. They're all divine, and they're all not identical. So would my argument get that there has to be four? No, right? It doesn't entail the conclusion. So it doesn't show that there couldn't be three, or that there has to be more than three, right? That's not entailed by my argument. The argument just shows exactly what it's designed to show, which is that there's at least two. And then, whether there's a third one or not, it's not that I'm not trying to prove that there's a third divine person. It's just supposed to be an argument against Unitarian theologies like Islam or Judaism, or like Unitarian Christianity. So the point isn't to show definitely that the doctrine of the Trinity is true. The point is just to show that definitely these Unitarian theologies are not true.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so basically the argument as it stands is basically saying, well, there could be some reason why there would be an exact number of divine persons, but it's just not stated. It's like there could be, but there's at least two divine persons.
I mean, just like if I can prove that there's some number that satisfies some certain conditions, I haven't proved that there's not more numbers, or that there has to be infinitely many. It just like I can show you one. I mean, maybe I can show you a second one, but it's not intended to do that. I mean, there are. There's at least half a dozen arguments for why there should be exactly three divine persons. It's not part of my argument to try to do that. So if Jake wanted to say there's not any such argument that would be successful, then it would be incumbent upon him either to go, at least go through all of the arguments that there are and show why none of them work, or he needs to give some kind of metalogical proof for why you couldn't do it. But he hasn't done any of those.
Does your argument lead to the conclusion that there is an arbitrary number of divine persons?
I mean, so again, it depends on what's meant by arbitrary. If arbitrary means like something that I subjectively, personally don't understand, I mean, maybe. but I mean, but anyway, I mean, it proves that there's at least two divine persons.
Yeah.
If arbitrary means any number between 1 and infinity, then yeah, because it shows there's at least two. But it doesn't. That doesn't seem to matter.
Well, it wouldn't be 1 and infinity, would it? It would be like 2 and infinity, wouldn't it?
Well, the argument shows it's a number between 1 and infinity.
Okay.
Well, it's a number greater than 1, right?
Yeah, greater than 1. That's what I thought.
The thing is that if arbitrary means just like a number between 1 and infinity, then fine. But there's all kinds of cases where there are necessary truths like that. Like I was saying, 666 and 2583 are the two numbers that satisfy a certain operation. Like there's 5 numbers that satisfy certain. Like there's plenty of functions where it crosses the x-axis 5 times or 3 times or 12 times, and that's it, right? So if that's what's meant, I mean, there can be necessary truths that are arbitrary in the sense of just being somewhere. Sorry, that was my cat. Being somewhere between 1 and infinity. But if arbitrary means like there just does not exist any reason, there does not exist any necessitating reason why it should be true, then I would say no. So first of all, anyone who's going to run the ontological argument has to accept the identity of indiscernibles for divine persons, which just says that if X and Y have all the same properties, then they're identical. Because if you don't accept that, then you're saying there are possible worlds where there are multiple divine beings that are exactly alike, but they're numerically distinct. And what that means is then you would get infinitely many divine persons. If you don't accept that principle, you're going to get multiple divine persons. You're going to get as many as you want, right?
So
you're going to have to accept the identity of indiscernibles, and then the Father and the Son will be individuated because they'll be discernible because one's Assay and one's Abalio. Then the question is just if there's anything else to individuate the second and third.
Yeah. I think what happens, I'm trying to just characterize something. It may be helpful, but it may not be. I think what Jake has to argue then is that like there could not possibly be any reason why there would be a certain number of divine persons.
Yeah, he has to say there couldn't possibly be a reason why there couldn't possibly be anything to individuate a second and third divine person.
Well, also he has to make the claim that there couldn't possibly be that there's a less than infinite number of ways to individuate divine persons.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he has to make that claim because you've made this distinction about arbitrariness in one sense and in another. And if you're just saying that, I'm trying to put this into words because I'm only just thinking about this now, but yeah, I think because you're saying your distinction between arbitrary is that like there could be a reason, basically. So it's not arbitrary because there could be a reason. So in order for him to say that your view is arbitrary in the kind of the unvirtuous sense, then there would have to be no reason why there is a limited number of ways.
He'd need to show that there's no set of true propositions that would entail that there's exactly 3 or there's exactly 2 or whatever.
Yeah.
But then, like I said, I mean, there's all kinds of there's plenty of arguments that have been given for this. Like, Richard of St. Victor is a Western author who famously said, God, he thinks God's love requires that there's a second divine person, and then he thinks there's a qualitative difference between an individual loving an individual and then 2 individuals sharing love for a third, like a mother and father loving a child is different. Sharing love for a child is different from them just loving each other. But and then he thinks there's nothing to be gained from a fourth, right? So like there's no qualitative difference between 2 people sharing love and 3 people sharing love or something. Just more sharing. Maybe that's a bad argument, but if you're going to say there's no argument, then you have to say why that argument doesn't work. Aquinas and others will say like, well, there's exactly 2 intellectual operations that can be self-directed. And that's knowledge and love. Like, so I can know myself, like mentally, I can know my own mind and I can love my own mind. And loving presupposes knowing. I can't love something that I don't know, but knowing isn't the same as loving, because I can know something that I don't love. So if God loves himself, that presupposes that he knows himself, and he's going to argue that that generates two different divine persons, and not anymore, because there's not anything else. If you start talking about power is something that you can direct outside that you do direct outside yourself. Maybe that's a bad argument, right? There's an argument that it's all of God's properties kind of boiled down to knowledge and power, or knowledge and life, or something like that, and that's the Son and the Holy Spirit. I mean, there's just
well, also, like, just to make it, I guess, more simple, what do you think of this? Like, it gets around this idea of is this an internal critique or an external critique? Because if it's an internal critique, then can Jake please actually show why we have to believe in, or why we have to believe in
4 divine persons, or we can't believe in 2 divine persons,
or why we have to, or why we have to believe that, like, or why we, I don't know, why we can't believe there is a certain number of causal relations. Like, I don't know, like.
Well, that's another thing. Is like a lot of he seems to act like, oh, that's just kind of made up. But like, for most of the history of Western thought, like prior to the early modern period, everybody believed in final causation, in addition to efficient causation and formal causation and material causation. But that doesn't really apply in the case of God. But I mean, it's only in the modern period that everybody just starts to jettison the idea that there's such a thing as final causation. And that's also something, like, it's always been, I mean, here's another thing, right? So, I mean, Augustine makes this point, like, any created thing that exists, right? It has to exist. It has to have form, right? It has to be some particular kind of thing. It has to have form, and it has a final cause. It has a purpose. It has, right, there's something that is its telos, or its good, and those, it's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit provide those jointly, and they cooperate in creating all these things, which is another, of many arguments for why there's 3 divine persons. But yeah, I mean, it's only in the modern period that everybody just decided, well, formal causation and final causation is all bull crap, and there's just,
I guess the thing is that I don't think Jake's going to affirm that there's an infinite number of kinds of causal relations, and I don't think he's going to affirm that there's only one kind of causal relation. But even if there was only one kind, then you'd still have a binary.
He might, but I mean, but he needs to say why it's implausible to think that there's something like we're familiar with physical causation and mental causation, or why is it that there's not efficient causation and final causation, right? Traditionally, both of those have been thought, I mean, they were thought to both be causes of motion and things like that. Why can't there be? You could go on and on about with reasons that people have thought to distinguish between 2 different kinds of causation, or causation and grounding, or whatever it might be. But again, I mean, there's at least half a dozen or more of these kinds of arguments, and it's only really, I think, in the context of modern philosophy and what's come after it, that people start to just think, well, there's only one kind of causation, there's only one sense of causation, and
well, I mean, this kind of just shows that, I mean, we're not saying we're taking any of those arguments or points per se. Like,
the point is just that if he's going to say they don't exist, or that they're not good, then he needs to go in with all the arguments people have given over the centuries and say why none of them work. Or if he's not going to do that in a kind of piecemeal way, then he needs to give a metalogical sort of proof for why you couldn't possibly individuate a second and third person in any other way.
Yeah, or why there also couldn't possibly be a non-infinite number of ways to individuate, like a definite non-infinite number of ways,
Right, yeah,
like 4 or 3 or whatever.
right,
So this is a lot of burden of proof that's not been met,
right.
frankly. All right, now let's move on to the cross-examination from your end, because
Oh,
this
yeah,
was
yeah.
the, as Trent Horn would say, this was the cheesecake of the debate.
The
Uh,
cheesecake. Um,
I love when
well,
he said that once. It was just so funny.
well, I
But
mean, here's the thing about that. So like I just said, right? If you like, I just plugged all this stuff in, and like,
can I play the cross-examination,
yeah,
and then
sure, go ahead.
we'll pause it at the bits you wanna
Cool. Okay.
pause at, and then we'll discuss some
Well,
of the arguments we have
mhm,
on this. And also, this is good because actually, I think if you watch the Khalil debate, you
mhm.
need to like watch this as like the
Yeah,
prelude.
right.
This is like the prelude to Khalil debate.
Yeah,
You watch this, and they go together nicely. It's like a
yeah.
cool. So here we.
All right.
Hopefully, this should be visible. All right.
So, is there anything, as far as you can tell, about the definition of omniscience that would require a being to be Assay if it was omniscient?
Omniscience, and how are you defining it?
So, however you ordinarily think about omniscience.
Let me know when you want me to
just
pause, by
knowing
the way.
all truths or something like that.
I don't think so.
Okay. What about being omnibenevolent? So just, always having a morally perfect will or something like that.
No, I don't think omnibenevolent. I mean, going back to omniscience, the only thing I can think of is that if the effect can't really know the nature of the cause, then that would be a problem.
Okay. So maybe you'd say it's not true just from sort of the definition of omniscience, although there might be some metaphysical issue there, depending. What about this? So this is sometimes for. So that's something he mentioned in his debate review. I think it's worth pointing out. So at these first few questions, I asked him about just the definitions of omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and so forth. And he said, yeah, there's no conflict in the definitions of these properties with being ab alio. In his debate review, he pointed out that that's not the same thing as saying they are metaphysically compossible. So, in other words, what he's getting at is there could be some synthetic a priori metaphysical, law of metaphysics, as he wants to say, or whatever, that would generate a conflict. And that's an example of one. He said, well, maybe if it's impossible for the effect to fully know the cause or something like that. The problem is, I mean, it's fair enough. It's a fair point that there's a difference between saying that, it's analytic that you can't be ab alio if you have this proposition versus just saying, well, it's this synthetic a priori impossibility. But the problem is that he didn't actually ever give any synthetic a priori impossibility. So like this is an example, but I don't think even he believes that it's impossible for the effect to know the cause. And if he did, it wouldn't be an internal critique anymore, right? It'd just be like, well, okay, why should we think that the effect can't know its cause? And it's another one of these cases where if he did have some such argument, then that would just directly prove the Eunomian premise. And so he could have just done without all of his other arguments, right? So if for some reason there really is, if you really can back up this claim that an effect can't know its cause, then an ab alio divine person couldn't really fully know God the Father, right? So he wouldn't be omniscient, so he wouldn't have the divine nature. So bam. I mean, that's your whole argument. So if he really had any kind of synthetic a priori metaphysical reason why being ab alio conflicts with one of these standard kind of, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, that would be all he would need. And so here again, I'll just say, I mean, if you've got something like that and it's based on premises that I accept, like, just send it to me and I'll stop being a Trinitarian. Like, just write, just like I've written this out, in symbolic terms, and if you'll write out an argument for me that shows that you can't be ab alio and have all the sort of standard properties you would associate with the divine nature, other than being assay, then if you can show me these metaphysical principles that lead to that conclusion, then I'll accept it.
Well, I think even then, wouldn't this kind of turn on? There might be a dispute over a definition of omniscience. I suppose this is the thing.
Well, sure. I mean, you'd have to you'd have to define what you mean by omniscience, and you'd have to give a definition that I would accept, right? And a metaphysical principle that I would accept, and then it has to be valid. It has to actually be a valid argument. So, I mean, if he can do that, that's great, but he didn't present anything like that during the debate. Mm-hmm. So, for example, St. Irenaeus and some other church fathers put it this way. They talk about the Son and the Holy Spirit as like the right and left hands of God. So, meaning sort of they're like these, causal intermediaries that God interacts with the world through. I know there's kind of I guess different people have different views about this, but in the Quran, it talks a little about God's hands or whatever. So some people, I know, take that very literally. Some people just take it to be, I guess, a metaphor for something like the way God causally interacts with things or attributes or something like that. How do you take that? Do you take it that God literally has physical hands, or do you take those to be kind of attributes, or do you have a different interpretation of it?
They're attributes.
They're attributes. Okay. But they're distinct from God himself.
In what sense?
Meaning just God isn't a hand, or whatever.
They're not identical to him. But they're not separate. They're not separable.
Okay. So they're not identical. Okay, but they're not separable. So there's would you say there's been any time at which God was without these attributes?
No.
And so would you say that the attributes are created?
No. Why would they be created?
It's not a trick question. I just want to make sure make sure that I'm on the right page. So what about their existence in different possible worlds? Do you think there are possible worlds where God lacks those attributes?
No.
Okay. So those attributes, then it's safe to say, are necessarily existent, they're eternal, and they're uncreated. Are they also assay?
Depends what you mean by that.
Are they in any sense caused or dependent on God, or are they just kind of independent things that aren't in any sense?
They're not independent of God.
Okay, so that you wouldn't say they're like absolutely assay beings, like
no,
Lane Craig with his Cerberus Trinity or whatever. Okay, so then it seems like we've gotten the conclusion that necessary existence as such doesn't require aseity. Eternality as such doesn't require aseity. Yeah. So the point here, right? So all through the debate, like I mentioned this before, he seems to be assuming this principle that anything that's not absolutely assay is going to be contingent, right? Anything that's ab alio in any sense will be contingent. And I mean, basically, I'm just pointing out this is a strict logical contradiction, right? Because the attributes of God, he's going to say they're not absolutely assay, but they're not contingent. They exist in every possible world. So that's just a strict logical contradiction. What he starts doing next here is he's going to say, well, they're not analogous. It's not similar to whatever, but it's not an argument by analogy. So I just was happy to say, sure, I'll stipulate that it's not, there's no analogy here. I'm not making an argument by analogy. The argument is if everything that is in any sense ab alio has to be contingent, then these divine attributes that are in some sense ab alio would have to be contingent, right? And so it's important to note, like, that there's only, like, when I laid out these, you know, that the so my modal ontological argument, it's valid. It doesn't entail that there's 4 divine persons. It doesn't entail there can't be 3. It doesn't give you a contradiction, etc. The only way really that he could have given an internal critique, right? So the only propositions that I would have accepted, well, the only way that it could have that he could have caused a conflict with things that I actually believe. I mean, number one would just be to assume the Eunomian premise itself, which would be circular. The other is this principle of we can call it the contingency of ab alio beings. So if it was true that all ab alio beings have to be contingent, then that would entail the Eunomian premise, given that only a divine individual, given that it's not possible to have a divine individual that's just contingently existent. So you could get an argument for the Eunomian premise if you accept literally that anything that's ab alio is contingent, which I reject. But, you know, if he had really stuck to that, you know, then that would be something that he could use. But here he's just strictly contradicted that, because the divine attributes he's going to say are ab alio. They're not assay, but they're not contingent.
Well, here's the thing: is he might quibble over, I think, your use of the word existent being, but the premise he had was like, if X is ab alio, then it is contingent, or it can't be necessary.
Yeah.
And then you can just, like you said, we'll play it.
Yeah. Uncreatedness as such doesn't require aseity. None of those 3 things in combination apparently requires aseity. Also, it seems like the you know, sort of standard attributes you might think that God would have, like omniscience and omnibenevolence and omnipotence and so forth, don't just sort of by definition require aseity.
I'm not really following what you're saying, to be honest.
Well, just I mean, just those. So none of those attributes requires.
Yeah, but how does it map onto the discussion? Because this seems to really be deviating from the discussion.
Right. So the question is, can you have the divine nature without aseity? And it looks to me,
yeah,
like
but
all of that
that's not the same thing, Beau. When you talk about the hand of God, or you talk about the power, it's not.
So the issue here is just this. What I'm doing is saying, look, it's just kind of mysterious, right? Like, if omniscience doesn't require aseity, and omnipotence doesn't require aseity, and omnibenevolence doesn't require aseity, being necessarily existent doesn't even require aseity. Being uncreated, being eternal. I mean, none of the, you know, individually, nothing that we associate with the divine nature seems to require aseity. Why is it that you can't have them all together and require, you know, that requires aseity? I mean, it just seems like an honest question. Like, why? I mean, and I honestly do, like, I puzzle over this. Like, why would you think that you can't have the divine nature without aseity? But then it turns out that every, you know, individual sort of aspect of the divine nature you could have without aseity. And so the issue isn't an argument by analogy. I'm not making an analogy between, you know, the way Jake thinks about the attributes and the way that that we think about the divine persons, the hypostases. The point isn't that there's any analogy between a hypostasis and an attribute. The point is that if being ab alio is compatible with each individual, property or aspect of the divine nature, then it's just a mysterious issue, like why it wouldn't be compatible with all of them together. And also, I mean, what he's going to talk about is like, I mean, so that, I guess, and I mean, after the debate that he had with Khalil, I honestly don't understand. I have no idea what his his view actually is, because in that debate, it seems like that God, I don't know. I mean, who knows? But anyway, let's just suppose that the attributes are like abstract objects. Well, it's fine to say, okay, well, they're abstract, so it's, I'm gonna complicate this picture. Instead of saying that anything that's ab alio has to be contingent, I'll say anything that is ab alio and concrete has to be contingent.
Can you briefly explain the concrete abstract distinction for the audience?
Oh, sure. I mean, so intuitively, right, like I'm a concrete thing, a table's a concrete thing, a rock is a concrete thing, air is a concrete thing, but something like the property of being red is abstract. The number 5 is abstract. So these aren't like things that causally interact with the world or anything like that. They don't have causal powers, maybe. There's different ways that people try to kind of make that precise. Usually in terms of causal powers, but that's actually, I mean, that's something that might be problematic, because I think that the Islamic doctrine of attributes is that they do have causal power. Like that's actually what God uses to know things or will things or do things. So it's not clear if how abstract they are. But anyway, let's just suppose that there's some kind of important distinction there, right? The point is that what Jake would need to do would be to complicate his picture. I already don't see why being ab alio requires being contingent, right? I already don't see the connection there. And now it's not even that like being ab alio requires being contingent. It's that being ab alio and concrete requires being contingent, but being ab alio and abstract doesn't. But in any case, even if you do that, right, all I have to do is say, is being concrete compatible with being ab alio? And obviously it is, right? You and I are concrete and we're ab alio. So it's the same thing, right? Omniscience doesn't require aseity. Omnipotence doesn't require aseity. Omnibenevolence doesn't require aseity. Being necessarily existent doesn't require aseity. Being concrete doesn't require aseity, right? So it's still a mystery. Like, why is it that being concrete and necessary and omniscient, omnipotent, blah, 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 requires aseity when none of those things individually does?
Well, you can make it even more, I think, kind of specific. So, more kind of general, I guess. So, if X is ab alio, then X must be ab alio, must be contingent or cannot be necessary. Mm-hmm. And then you just
according to him
plug the attributes in. Yeah.
Well, right. That's what I mean is that you just get a strict logical contradiction out of what Jake affirmed, right? Which is he just said, if it's ab alio, then it's definitely contingent, but the divine attributes are ab alio.
Yeah, he says the divine attributes are ab alio, but not contingent. But but they are necessary. So for him to negate that for the Trinity, he'd have to modify his original premise to be, if X is ab alio and X is a hypostasis, and or X is concrete, then it has to be contingent or something like that. But there's no, haven't heard the argument for that.
Yeah, and it something I pointed out at the very end of my closing statement was like he could get out of the contradiction by complicating this claim, right? So it's not just that ab alio things are contingent, but that it's that ab alio and concrete things are contingent. So then he could get it to where he's not contradicting himself. But then the problem is that he has to go back to all of the arguments where he's been using this claim that ab alio things in general are contingent. And he's going to have to modify that. And then he's going to have to support this claim that things that are contingent in ab alio have to be, or sorry, things that are concrete in ab alio have to be contingent. And part of the point of that is that, when you have a very simple metaphysical claim like being ab alio requires being contingent, then it's like, well, maybe that's true, right? I mean, if it's something pretty simple, then like maybe there's some maybe it would play a role in some other argument, and if it's simple enough, then that's part of what we look for in theories is simplicity. But once you start making it more and more complicated, then you have to start asking, like, is this really true? So like an example of this is like, old-fashioned Ptolemaic astronomy just said like the Earth is at the center and there are these spheres, around it. So the moon is in one sphere and the sun's in another sphere and the planets, and then there's the outermost sphere with the fixed stars, and the outermost sphere just turns around in a circle. So that's why we get the seasons and the zodiac signs going around. And the moon goes around in a circle and the sun goes around in a circle, and that's all there is to it. But then you realize, well, it doesn't actually get the right predictions because the sun, during this, as the seasons go, like the sun starts to kind of tilt forward and back in the sky. So, well, maybe there's got to be another sphere inside the sphere where, one sphere is turning this way while the other sphere is kind of going back and forth. But then like what stops it? Okay, well, there must be some other sphere that's doing this. And, and then the planets have these zigzaggy motions. So like, by the time we abandoned Ptolemaic astronomy with Galileo and everything, like they had these, there's like all these tons and tons of different little epicycles to try to explain it in this framework. And eventually you just think like, well, it's not a very elegant theory anymore, right? Like once a theory becomes super complicated, it becomes unworkable. And I'm just pointing out that, that what's happening here is when he has a really simple metaphysical claim, he ends up getting a contradiction with his own beliefs. And so what he has to do, and it's already not really plausible. There's no real reason to think that being ab alio requires being contingent, but now he's going to have to make it even more complicated. It's that, well, unless it's abstract and then it can be grounded. But also part of the issue with that too is that it's not clear. It's not totally clear. It's not clear that there's a difference in the relation between the Islamic attributes and God versus the relation between the Son and Spirit and God in Christian theology, because he wouldn't say that the attributes are like physically being caused, like they're not brought into being or something like that. He would say something like they're, it's like metaphysical grounding, right? It's eternal, it's timeless, whatever. But that's what we say about the Son and the Spirit, is that they're grounded. Their existence is grounded in the existence of the Father, and that's timeless and eternal. It's not like a physical thing. So he goes back and forth here between here and in his debate review between. Sometimes he'll say it's not analogous, and I just say fine because it's not an argument by analogy, so it doesn't matter, right? Then sometimes he'll say the issue is that the attributes are not separable from God. But if that's the issue, then it doesn't matter, because we would say the same thing about the Son and Spirit. So if it's something like, okay, an ab alio being is contingent if separable. Well, we don't say that the Son and the Spirit are separable from the Father. So it just we'd be back to it wouldn't even matter, right? And then sometimes it sounds like, well, it's really the issue is whether they're concrete or abstract or something like that. But then, so anyway, it's just it's not clear what the idea is. I think he can modify his principle so he doesn't contradict himself, but it's just not clear if he did modify it so he wasn't contradicting himself, could he still get an argument against the Trinity? It's just not clear.
Yeah, I'm going to finish off the cross-examination.
It's not a nature. It's not a divine nature. So it's not analogous at all.
Divine nature.
Yeah, so it's not analogous to what we're talking about.
Okay, I mean, it doesn't have to be analogous. I'm content to say there's no analogy, but in terms of just possibility and necessity, it seems like so none of God's kind of qualitative properties like omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence require aseity, and none of these kind of other existential properties like necessity, eternality, uncreatedness, those factors don't require aseity. So it looks like
I don't understand what the relevance is. You're talking about an
issue. The question is, can you have the divine nature without aseity? Another way to put that would be if you take whatever attributes God has, since you believe in God, you're going to say those are all compossible, right? And I'm just saying, well, would they be compossible if you got rid of the aseity part and put in the caused part, right? And it looks So one thing to just point out here is that the point is that that's just logically equivalent, right? So to say that it's possible for God to exist just means there's a possible world where he exists. And if God exists in any possible world, he's going to have all of his essential attributes, right? So if God possibly exists, then he has all of his essential attributes. And if all of those essential attributes are possible, that's just to say it's possible for them to all be instantiated together in some individual in some possible world, right? So those are, essentially equivalent. And what I'm saying is, for there to be a son of God, for that to be possible is just for all of those properties to become possible. And so it's just logically equivalent, right? Whether it's possible to have a divine person, whether it's possible to have the divine nature without aseity is just logically equivalent to saying that the divine nature and being ab alio are compossible. And so I'm just saying with every sort of pairwise, analysis, like those are all compossible, right? So being ab alio is compossible with omniscience, it's compossible with omnibenevolence, and so on and so forth. So why aren't they all compossible together? So that's why it's relevant. Those are just logically equivalent ways of saying the same thing.
They wouldn't.
Like you're saying, individually, all of those attributes would be consistent with a lack of aseity.
No,
so
I'm not
I'd
saying
like
that.
to know why
I'm not saying that.
The combination. Okay,
I'm not saying that.
Yeah, let me hear what you do think. What are your thoughts on that?
I didn't say that at all, because the attributes are not something that is distinct from God. They are not things in themselves, which you're talking about. I really...
Hang on, can I just rewind this?
Sure. Individually, all of those attributes would be consistent with a lack of aseity.
No,
so
I'm not
I'd
saying
like
that.
to know why
I'm not saying that.
The combination. Okay,
I'm not.
Well, but he did say that. Like, I don't understand.
I guess maybe he's the most charitable way to analyze this, I guess, is maybe he's just thinking. So he's willing to admit that there's no conflict in the definitions of these things, but there's some synthetic a priori, principle, or whether you can't, so even though the definition of omniscience, let's say, doesn't entail aseity, maybe he just thinks it really is impossible to have omniscience without aseity. But he didn't present any reason. I mean, that's why I pause here and I just say, okay, fine. What is, tell me, what are your thoughts on that? And he never says, well, here's what I think. Omnipotence is incompatible with being ab alio. Omniscience is incompatible with. I mean, he never says what the conflict is. So
I'm not saying that.
Yeah, let me hear your what you do think. What are your thoughts on that?
I didn't say that at all, because the attributes are not something that is distinct from God. They are not things in themselves, which you're talking about. I really am lost with the relevance of this form of argumentation, because these are not separate, distinct Assay beings that all possess the same divine nature.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm not arguing for that, right? What I'm asking about is not the attributes themselves. What I'm asking about is these other properties. So the property of omniscience doesn't require aseity. So you could have omniscience in theory without aseity. You could have omnipotence without aseity. You could have omnibenevolence without aseity, so forth. You could be necessarily existent without aseity. You could be eternal. You could be uncreated without aseity. So those
no, I don't think so. I'm not agreeing to that.
You don't. But he just like seconds before or minutes before, like that's exactly what he said, that the divine attributes are not absolutely assay, but they're necessarily existent and eternal and uncreated and so forth. So I don't think God's attributes are necessary and eternal and uncreated, but not assay.
I don't think that they can exist apart from him. You can't have a separation between God and his attributes and then have a discussion about
He doesn't actually even answer the question you're asking.
That's the thing that's frustrating, is like he's just changing the subject. Like the question is, are the attributes, they fail to be assay. They're ab alio in some sense, but they're necessary, and he just changes the subject from their ab alio but necessarily existent to, well, they can't be separated, but it doesn't matter whether they're separated or not. I mean, I can do a logic thing with that, but anyway, I mean, it should be pretty obvious, right? Like you're saying, if something's ab alio, then it's contingent, but these things are ab alio and not contingent. And she keeps changing the subject from the fact that they're ab alio on his account to, well, they're not separable or something. But again, here, I mean, again, like if he wants to complicate his claim and say, well, it's really that it's if something is ab alio and separable from an assay thing, then it's got to be contingent. Then okay, well now you've lost your argument against me, right? Because I don't think that the Son and Spirit are ab alio and separable from the assay thing. Right. So if he wants to just kind of go on to the topic of being separable, then it seems like.
But the other thing is, he can't just assert these things, like whether it's ab alio and separable, ab alio and a hypostasis, ab alio and concrete. If he thinks the attributes are abstract, I don't think that makes sense, because the attributes.
Yeah, no, there's multiple problems. I mean, one is that it's all just assertion, and there's nothing to back up. I mean, there's nothing to back up the original claim either, and there's nothing to back this claim up either. But it just seems to me like, I mean, the original claim just directly contradicts his own theology. If you patch it up by talking about separation, then this principle can no longer be used, because I don't believe that the Son and Spirit are separable. If you start trying to talk about whether there's an analogy between the attributes and the hypostases, then it doesn't matter, because this isn't an argument by analogy. It's that he's just contradicted himself. It's just not clear how, like, I mean, he could patch it up so he's not contradicting himself, but it's not clear that he could patch up the contradiction in such a way that there's any reason to believe that his principle is true, and that it's going to work against the doctrine of the Trinity and so forth. So
here's the other argument, and I think you should probably bring this up if you do a review of the Khalil debate. Jake wants to say premise 1, being caused entails being contingent, which is logically equivalent to being necessary entails being uncaused. Sorry.
Right. Yeah.
It follows that premise 2, if the hands, or whatever attributes, are necessary, they must be uncaused.
Yeah.
But he himself will want to say premise 3, only God can be uncaused.
Right.
So, C, if the hands attributes are necessary, then they are God himself. They are identical to God.
Right.
and the conclusion follows from premise 2 and premise 3. Premise 2 just follows from premise 1.
Yeah.
So the only way to deny the conclusion, which is that if the hands are necessary, then they are identical to God, either you have to deny P1 or premise 1 or premise 3,
Yeah.
and he needs to affirm premise 1 to argue against monarchical Trinitarianism, and he needs to deny the conclusion for his argument against
Right.
Khalil, because he needs
Right.
to deny simplicity. And this is why actually I think Eunomius. So
Mhm.
this is like the Eunomian riposte, I guess, because it's like Eunomius could believe and make these arguments because he believed in an
Yes, he believed in
identity
absolute divine simplicity. Yeah.
because he believed in an identity thesis
Yeah.
version of simplicity, and so so he could do that, but Jake doesn't believe in simplicity, so he can't make these arguments against the Trinity. And if he accepts simplicity, then well, he has no argument against Khalil on the at least on the issue of simplicity.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
has to give up atherism. So
If
yeah,
you want to
definitely
share,
definitely write this out in a slide or something if you do that review of that debate.
oh, I've got some stuff. I mean, I can, not a slide, but I mean, if you want to share my screen again, I can put that up, put that argument up for
Yeah,
people.
put it up.
Yeah. So I mean, here's the let's see. Can you see my screen?
I can see the logic calculator. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Here we go. So this would be this would say anything that's ab alio is contingent, right? So that could, I mean, that would be a problem for me. But let's suppose, I'm just gonna represent the attributes with the letter A. So let's just take some random attribute, whatever it is.
Represent it with the letter H for hand.
Or H, I can do that, right? So the hand is from something, right? It's not assay. And the hand exists in all possible worlds, right? So here you go, P and not P. It's just a straight contradiction, right? So that's the issues, and that's why, like, I didn't really care about, is there an analogy or anything like that? Like, it's just a straight contradiction, right? So you've got to do something with it. So he's got a few options here. So here's what here's a way to kind of map out the options a little more fine-grained way. So this says only God is assay. I mean, I guess we could make it necessarily. I mean, he's going to say necessarily only God is assay, right? This says, well, let's change it to hand. So the hand exists in every possible world, and the hand is not identical to God, right? Because he rejects absolute divine simplicity. But this says, this is his principle that anything that is ab alio has to be contingent. Well, contradiction, right? So what are his options? Well, here's his argument against me, right? Anything that's ab alio has to be contingent, right? I mean, this is something he certainly believes. Only God can be assay. Here's his claim that the hand exists necessarily, and here's the claim that the hand is not identical to God. Now, if you got rid of that, right? So if you say no, the hand is identical to God, okay, then you don't have a contradiction anymore. But if he wants to say that God isn't, or if he said that the hands don't necessarily exist, right? So God doesn't have any essential attributes. Otherwise, I mean, he's going to have to give up, that God's the only assay being. Which, if he gives that, I mean, frankly, like if he wanted to say that there's more than one thing that is assay, like if he wanted to go William Lane Craig and sort of say, like, well, God has all of these parts and they're all assay and God's assay, like that was what, to me, like with the debate with Khalil, it's like that's not Tawhid. Like I have a better sense of Tawhid, right? Like I wouldn't say there's more than one thing that's assay. Like for me, it's the Father, the person of the Father is assay. And I think, I mean, I take an Aristotelian sort of position on attributes and natures. I think those are dependent on the concrete individuals that instantiate them. So I've just got the God the Father as Assay. That's it. If he wants to say that the attributes are distinct from God, meaning they're not identical to God, because he doesn't believe in divine simplicity, but they're also Assay. Well, then you've got these multiple things that are Assay, or there's these parts of God that are all Assay. And I think that came out in his debate with Khalil, that it's like you've got this Captain Planet view of God. There are all these independent things that sort of make him up or something. But in any case, I mean, these are your options, right? You've got to either say something that is not identical to God is Assay, which to me, like, if that's not polytheism, I don't know what polytheism would be. Or you have to give up on God having these, necessarily existent attributes, or absolute divine simplicity, right? Or you give up this argument against me.
Yep.
So those are your options.
Yep. I think that wraps it up nicely. Can you make some any comments on your impression of Jake and his arguments based on your experience as a professor and your experience with undergrads?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess my understanding is he has an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and I thought he was pursuing a graduate degree, but I'm not quite clear on that, or where it is, or what he's doing. But anyway, yeah, I mean, a lot of time, like, I think that Jake has a lot of potential, and I would like to see him go to graduate school for an actual, like, in a philosophy department. And I think that would be good. And I think, I mean, I kind of tried to encourage him to participate in some, philosophy of religion kind of groups and things. I think it would be a good thing for analytic philosophy of religion to have some non-Christian theistic philosophers. I think some Islamic philosophers coming into analytic philosophy would be a good thing. So I wish that he would do something with that. I think he has potential, but I think he needs to get a little more kind of training. But I think that this is something that happens a lot with undergraduates. I've noticed that they have a lot. You'll have a clever undergraduate, has a lot of good ideas. They're really thinking about these logical connections and so forth. But it's just kind of scatterbrained and ADD and all over the place, and they have a hard time sometimes, like, focusing on the point at hand. Like, I taught philosophy of religion last semester, and I had a really cool and interesting and intelligent undergraduate guy, and he was an atheist, or kind of going through, doubting things. And so he was really thinking about all these things, and he had a lot of really great ideas. But I mean, from time to time, he'd be trying to explain an argument. I'm like, you realize you actually just defended the theistic position. like so you're making some really good points about free will and all this stuff, but you actually, like, you need to either go a different direction or switch arguments or something. But yeah, I think they were just kind of not very focused. And I wish that he had done what we had agreed to, which was, we have these two debates. The first one's just the Eunomian Premise, and then the second one, you could kind of branch out into these broader issues if you think there are any with my argument. But it seems like he just wasn't able to kind of keep it together and just keep focused on the one thing. So, I mean, ultimately, the three arguments that he presented, you had the nature of natures argument, which just was based on a complete misunderstanding of Aristotelian metaphysics. And then you had the Assay Cow thing, which just wasn't even valid. And even if you tried to make it valid, it would make it superfluous if it was, and it was based on a logical fallacy. And then you had that last argument that was really just not even about the debate topic it wasn't really about this or the other debate topic. I mean, it just was kind of about Lewis and Langton's definitions, and didn't seem to have any obvious relevance. So yeah, I hope that he will go and pursue maybe a graduate degree in philosophy. I think he has potential. Just needs a little more kind of intellectual discipline, I think. But
I'll take one question, because this
Yeah.
one person has been just really wanting to. He asked multiple questions, but I don't want to go. I can't go through all of them. But I think one that would be good was this. What do you think about Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction,
Oh.
and how do you think this might relate to orthodox, or to, I guess, orthodox metaphysics?
Metaphysics. Well, I'm not a fan of Quine's critique of the analytic synthetic distinction. How does it relate to? I mean, that's a pretty big topic. I mean, it's. I mean, if true, right? So Quine, for those who don't know, rejected the idea that there was any difference between analytic and synthetic propositions. I mean, if true, that has pretty big ramifications for all kinds of metaphysics, but I don't buy that, and I don't think. I don't think a lot of metaphysicians do. I think it depends if you're talking about people in metaphysics or philosophy of language or what, but I mean, I can't say. I mean, if the worry is something about like that would be relevant to what I said to respond to the criticisms of the Lewis and Langton definitions. Again, like you don't really need to make the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic just to make the argument work. And there's about a half dozen different ways that people make this distinction. I mentioned during the debate, like. Sometimes people just define intrinsic in terms of duplicates. Like if you can understand what a duplicate is, well, the intrinsic properties are the ones that would be had by an exact duplicate. So if you just intuitively understand, or you just intuitively understand the difference. There's also ways, I mean, people have tried to define it in terms of truth makers, semantics, and grounding. So there's multiple different ways to make that distinction. It's not really clear that the distinction is necessary. But I'll just say, I mean, for my part, I think there's a difference between analytic and synthetic propositions. But if there wasn't, I don't think it would affect this argument.
Yeah. Well, I think that's that. I think that's all. Unless you have any other comments.
What was it? I think. There was now I can't seem to find my notes on it. There were a couple of things that Jake's co-host, I think his name's Abdul Rahman, is that his? Anyway, there were a couple of comments that he made during their stream that I thought were interesting, but don't ultimately go anywhere. So he made some comment at the end that I thought didn't really work, but was interesting. There was another one somewhere, but I can't find my notes on them right now. But I will say this, though, too, that there were also a few things if you watch their debate review, there were a number of times when the way that they characterized my position was not exactly accurate, too. So I think in a few cases, it was something like aseity is accidental to the father, or the son is accidental, or something like that. And those are. So anyway, point being, watch my presentations and watch the debates.
Well, it sounds like the kind of stuff someone would say if they'd only just discovered what the difference between essential or like.
Exactly. I mean, it was like things like that where it's like, well, that doesn't follow from what I'm saying, but it's just kind of their own editorializing or like their own way of thinking about it, because they don't maybe get certain distinctions. So I'm just saying as a warning, like, don't necessarily assume that their characterization of my view is accurate, because there were a number of these things where it's just like that's not an accurate characterization of my view. Watch my debate or my presentations, and then take the other with a grain of salt, I guess. But I think that's all I had to say. I mean, basically 3 arguments. One based on a misunderstanding of metaphysics, one that was just invalid, and one that who knows how it even was supposed to be related.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on again. I'm
welcome.
sure there will be another occasion. You know,
So.
I'm sure.
Oh, I do. I will say this. Jake kind of expressed not wanting to do a second debate. I have decided, kind of as a result of this, that I'm not going to debate anyone in the future that doesn't have a PhD, because I think it ended up being kind of a waste of time. But since I said to Jake that I would do a second debate, if he decides that he wants to do a second debate, I'm happy to do it. But I kind of agree with him that he sort of blew his load with like what he would have talked about on the second debate, and there probably isn't much of a point to it. But if he wants to, I'm open to it. I've told one other person that I'll do a debate, but I think after that, I'm not going to be doing any further debates with people that don't have PhDs, because it just seemed like it was not necessarily the most fruitful thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, and we'll see all the people next time.
All right. I'll see you later.